Okay, I'm biased to Nakamura, Hikaru, because he plays on the ICC a lot. You can get to see him, and you can occasionally, in a blue moon, you might even play him. So here against Ruslan Ponomariov, 2744 GM, slightly higher rated than him by 3 points, not too much. So Ruslan plays d4 and Naka plays the very exciting Dutch defence, which is not often seen in games between 2700s. Was it Tartakower, one of the classical masters? He was experimenting with things like the Dutch. But other than that, it hasn't experienced that much popularity, the Dutch defence, because it slightly weakens the king side. There's all sorts of tortuous variations to which white can consider, not just following like c4. And in this case, Ruslan plays his weapon of choice is knight c3 with a sort of Trompovsky idea soon of bishop g5. So after d5, okay, there's potentially horrendous dark square weaknesses. Naka's, I'm sure, aware of the concept of dark square weaknesses. So bishop's g5, c6. Where is he going to get his counterplay from? Will he be able to adequately, defend and put pressure on e5? Okay, these are some of the questions. Now, immediately, well, c6 has an idea supporting the centre. Okay, he can't move the pawn at the moment, and he might want to unpin the pawn. In fact, his next move now, after e3, he unpins the pawn with queen b6, also exposing the weakness of the last move. Okay, that bishop is now not protecting b2, so why not try and gain a tempo as well as unpin this pawn, to try for the e5 break. So a3, of course, okay, the pawn can't be taken. I guess the queen's going to get trapped in some horrible way, which I can't actually... maybe it's even king d2. Okay, I didn't want to check it with an engine, but let's just make sure about this, that this is a little trap here. Queen takes b2, of course, knight a4, of course, once it's pointed out. Okay, the knight is stopping the exit back. Alright, just in case you were interested, okay, it's too early in the morning for me, sorry, but I'm excited by these games. Okay, so knight a4, I was looking at rook b, or king d2's even, okay, anyway. So bishop d3 was played, and now e6, okay, he's reserving the possibility of e5, maybe later, but he has to hold up, f5 as well. So that bishop d3, there's annoying pressure from white. Knight ge2, as if, maybe knight f4 attack e6 later. But if in that case, h6 and g5 have to be factored in. In fact, Naka plays h6 immediately. Bishop goes back here. Okay, that space is no longer reserved for the knight. The knight can maybe, maybe after h3, bishop h2, maybe knight f4 later, and then maybe reshuffle the pieces to go to e5 if needed. Okay, but these are all distant positional plans. How easy is it for white to exploit these dark square weaknesses? Okay, Naka's putting a lot of his pawns on light squares, as if he's playing drafts, checkers. So knight gf6, but can he get away with this against the 2744? It is just blitz chess. The increment is actually 2 seconds a move. Sorry about my inaccuracy. I said 1 second in the previous video. It's actually, I think it's 3 minutes initially, 2 second increment. So every move they play, they get an extra 2 seconds. So queen d8 here, b3. Now, interesting, a lockdown on c4 a little bit. b5, creating even another pawn on light squares. So this is really playing drafts. Okay, are these dark squares drafty though? Can they be exploited? These two now. So a6, white actually plays energetically c4, but black is not obliged to relieve the tension here. In fact, Naka just castles. Now after a4, this is interesting, he locks down the c3 square with b4, committing a pawn to b4. Okay, this could be useful if he could get a piece here later, or maybe even these two squares are highlighted, of course, by this pawn. a5, but is the pawn actually vulnerable? If c5 later, is this pawn going to be swallowed in some way? Is it a liability? That's the question now. But Naka liberates, protection of that pawn with a slight compromise. He plays c5. So this seems to be a bit of a confusing strategy, because did black want to play for e5? Like, we just completely, he's given up on that idea, and instead I think his idea really is just to try and keep his pieces active. And after CD, he gets a nice looking knight on d5. Okay, this is a bit ugly looking, this structure here, but how is this exploitable? This knight, you know, could also be supported by the bishop later. And again, like in that previous game we just saw, these bishops, you know, they point straight through the center. As part of the centralization strategy, Naka's really like intimate with the centre and piece play. After knight c4, bishop b7, and what can we say about black's pieces? There's no problem bishop. This isn't a problem bishop. Okay, he's moved his pawns a number of times, created a number of theoretical weaknesses, but are any of them exploitable in this position? It looks as though white's under tactical pressure. This idea of knight takes f4 if this knight ever moves. Okay, so actually white actually played bishop g3. Okay, he's trying to safeguard his position a little bit, but now comes c takes d4, and white really doesn't want maybe an isolated queen's pawn, especially with f4 would be like trapping the bishop. If cd, then f4 looks to trap the bishop actually. So this next move is practically forced, but it gives now, look, these two squares potentially for this knight. The knight hops in actually to c5. Without that white pawn on d4, these knights are running riot. And the activity of the black pieces is very strong here. Okay, there's now maybe a threat of knight c6 or knight g6. So one square is at least covered with rook c8. And now we see bishop c4. And now look, the other bishop points across the centre. So lovely bishops across the centre is like a common theme here of these two games. King h7. Okay, just safeguarding this position a bit, because I guess d5 is going to come under fire soon, this diagonal generally, so getting out of the way. But actually rook fc1, maybe that's a bit more passive, or you know, a serious consideration might have been given to rook d1. But this has got its own threats as well. Maybe this knight's vulnerable on the c file. Okay, but here now Naka seems to be resting visually at an advantage with this aggressive looking knight c3, so that's really justifying that pawn on b4. Okay, this pawn can't be taken, it's going to be knight takes queen check, the queen's attacked. Does white want to sack the exchange with rook takes c3, and then there's no knight e6 anyway, this knight's protecting e6. What am I talking about? So the queen moves, and now e6 is protected anyway with bishop d5. Look at all these pieces in the centre, it's really nice, this centralization. I mean, the initial pawn moves, you know, which we're often told, you know, we're often fearful of playing in our own games, is like a prelude, you know, to centralization strategy and piece activity. So here, actually, white's under severe pressure and probably under severe time pressure, and he plays what appears to be a horrendous blunder. He plays actually. Well, you know, black has the continual option now of bishop e5, and given that maybe, I'm not going to analyse this, but maybe knight f3, you know, he wouldn't be losing a piece, although e5 does look pretty scary at some point, but not there, just preparing e5, or maybe even bishop takes c4, bishop takes d4, and knight b3 just wins the exchange. Well, knight f... Okay. Let's just check this position. Could white hold this position? It looks pretty bad because of all this pressure on b3, on d4, on e5. In fact, Rybka does think black's a lot better, so it's recommending actually bishop f1, then queen e7. But what if knight f3? Okay, bishop c4, and again losing the exchange. Knight d3, just losing the exchange like that. Okay, but in the game there was a horrendous move. So this move played now, rook c2, and Naka just took on e5, which is one of the strongest moves. Maybe technically bishop c4 is also pretty strong, because if bishop takes c4, say knight takes c4, bishop d4. So what's going on here? Oh, knight takes b3, and look, everything's like getting attacked, and d4's on as well. So this is pretty nasty stuff. So in the game, this is like a very good move as well. And after bishop takes e5, now bishop takes c4, so it weakens d3 and b3, taking off white's light square bishop. And after b takes, now there's this killing move, knight d3, so hitting the queen and hitting this unprotected bishop. So that's how a 27-4-4 player, higher rated on the FIDE rating system, which is for long games, just got completely murdered from a Dutch defence in 27 moves. Let's have a look at that again. 27 moves, Dutch defence, a rarely played opening at this level. So a lot of dark square weaknesses. Okay, Queen B2 is not on because of knight A4. So black might have been considering E5 at some point in the future, but for the moment he just has to hold his fort together. He has to, and he starts putting a lot of pawns on light squares. Okay, lovely dark square weaknesses in theory, but in practice, is black getting compensatory piece play? He proved that there was compensation basically. After A4, maybe that's not so hot because B4 did seem to secure black some potential counterplay later, but it was very energetic play to follow it up to make sure the pawn's not going to be imprisoned with white playing C5. So black's knights are coming completely alive now, both of them very nice here, C5 D5, and the rook is also very dangerous, coming down on the C file, coming down on the C4 square, and now the bishops, it's beautiful that the coordination across the diagonals on their colour complexes. So Queen E2, there's a lot of tactical pressure being built up, bit of a prophylaxis type move against that diagonal, but it's not used anyway. The focus is put on the C file with rook FC1, and it seems unfortunate now that there's so much pressure that now bishop D5 really does guarantee not only protecting the pawn but starts to gain access to these two squares in particular tactically. So white is becoming highly tactically vulnerable and slips up now after this forcing move sequence, just losing an entire piece. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.